Gizmo is in very little of this movie.
Yes.
Like if you look at like the runtime of like the scenes that he is in, he's in maybe a fifth of the runtime of this movie, but he's the star, baby.
He's the guy.
And it is funny because they talk about later in a very self-referential way about all the money they're going to make merchandising Gizmo. But he's not really in the film. Again, here's what we should talk about.
I was going to say, this kind of hints at like maybe the overall allegory of this whole thing.
Yes, Joe Dante, who directed the first one and went on to direct my favorite movie, which we've talked about here, The Burbs, as well as other things. A very brilliant mind in directing. They wanted him to do a sequel. He said, no, we did the movie. The movie ends perfectly. There's no reason to do a sequel. It's just a cash grab. You know it's just a cash grab. I'm not going to be a part of your little cash grab. And they're like, fine, we'll find somebody else to be a part of our little cash grab. And we own the rights, not you, so we're going to do it. And they tried a bunch of times. They were in pre-production a few times. All these different ideas for how to do it. Different directors, different screenwriters, all this stuff never came to work. Never worked out. So they're like, fine, this is not going to work unless we get Joe Dante on board. So they backed up a gigantic dump truck full of money to his house and said, you can have complete creative control on this. Whatever you want to do with this movie, that's what we'll do. Because we are so desperate somehow to make millions of dollars off of little tiny Gizmo stuffed animals that we must make this movie. And he said, complete creative control. Is that what you said? Okay, cool. Let's do it. And he went about, I believe, and this is the allegory that we're talking about here, systematically destroying his own legacy with the first movie as a troll job to the producers who wanted to make a sequel. He actually sets out to make, and I think fully succeeds at making, a parody of the first one as a sequel to the first one, and also a parody of all other kinds of things. There's so many parodies of different kinds of television and stuff because there's a cable network that runs out of there. A parody of all kinds of monster movies, just all kinds of archetypes and stereotypes and tropes and everything, all put together. And he does it in a way that is brilliant, but also poking fun at his own masterwork that came out 5-6 years earlier. It's crazy.
I think, yeah, it's a parody of itself, and it's also a parody of the unnecessary sequel, which I think this was when this came out, kind of in the midst of a sequel heavy time, whether a movie warranted one or not. It almost reminded me, there were parts of this that were so self-effacing that it reminded me of when we talked about Team America and how they did that one scene that was just a big FU to the FCC because they were like, this puppet sex is too sexual, and they went back and made it a million times worse as like, and then it got approved because they never actually read it. It had a similar read to me at a lot of pieces of this. But what was funny was I like to, for movies I haven't seen yet and were like in this time period, I really like to go look at other people's takes on them, like other people's reviews before and after I watch them. And there were some people that were like, this was the dumbest thing I've ever seen. And then there were people that were like, this is the most brilliant thing I've ever seen. So it definitely went over some people's heads because like, this is, without abandon, like mostly a lot of gags, but they're wrapped up in this framework of a complete satire on itself. So it's, if you miss the overarching thing here, of course it falls flat because it's mostly just a bunch of gags. But I loved it. I thought it was a lot of fun. It got long at parts, but like for overall, when you are familiar with the backstory and you can kind of see what he was really going after, like even this idea of them taking over the city, like how many this thing we did, now it's happening in the city. It's such like a fantastic thing. All the horror movies that happen in the city too, like just a lot of fun things here.
Right, like without like it could not possibly have known that when it was making fun of the idea, like it is making fun of a bunch of movies that came out decades after it. Like, it is parodying, like, I don't know, man. I stopped watching the Jurassic Park movies, but I know one of the most recent ones, like the not only do they get off the island, they're everywhere. Dinosaurs are everywhere, taking over the world. And they're like, you can keep it. But like that kind of whole thing of like, what would happen if instead of being localized to this very small place, they went everywhere? And one of the original pitches was to have the Gremlins literally take over New York City, but they realized that was going to be too expensive. So they decided to do it all localized in a giant skyscraper. So Joe Dante decided to basically screw with everything and come up with the most ridiculous things he possibly could. And one of the other things he satirized was the impending technological changes that were happening, like the idea of video calls and stuff being prevalent. Like you would call from one floor to another in this giant building, and you'd be able to have like basically do FaceTime, but you'd have to actually hold the receiver to your ear because nobody could conceive of like any of these other kinds of things.
Essentially,
right?
Yeah.
Hey, what if you could do a phone call, but there'd be a person on a 4-inch screen in front of you? Like, but they didn't change anything else around it. But I also love that there's the elevators. There's the fact that there's a guy on a loudspeaker telling you very sanitized version of things, and also very snarky things. And this is why it feels so much like Airplane or Naked Gun or whatever. Is that the idea of like there's the scene in Airplane where they're walking through the airport, and there's the person on the intercom who's just doing like verbal gags about stuff without actually being a part of the scene. And that's the same way here, where there's all we see is Phoebe Cates, who also works at this high-rise as a tour guide. She's walking to an elevator, and you hear on the intercom guy go, with the person who owns the car, license number KL5442, please report to the parking garage and move your vehicle. It is old and ugly.
That just give me Airplane vibes of when they're doing that scene by the curb drop off, and she's like, "We know what this is about. You want me to have an abortion?" Like, very, very, very similar. Very similar vibes.
RESPECT. Click the subscribe button and find out what it means to me. Nah, that doesn't have a ring to it. But if you like videos about real news stories that are funny, stupid, or weird, subscribe now.